Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Monday, December 22nd, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 73.5 degrees with a low of 54.2. So expect a mild winter day with plenty of sunshine, ideal for getting out and enjoying the fresh air. Coming up, we'll break down the reasons behind the U.S. imposing sanctions on International Criminal Court judges amid investigations into Israel's actions in Gaza, and examine why California lacks the authority to restrict federal agents from wearing masks during immigration enforcement operations. Plus, other key developments from around the world and closer to home. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Good morning. The United States just tightened the screws on the International Criminal Court over its Israel war crimes probe. Ethan, bring us up to speed.
4 days ago, on December 18, the State Department announced new sanctions on two ICC appeals judges who upheld arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. According to AP News and Al Jazeera's coverage, those judges are Gocha Lord Kipanidze of Georgia and Erdenebel Seren Damdan of Mongolia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio framed the move as defending U.S. and allied nationals from what he called politicized prosecutions.
What exactly triggered this latest round now?
The appeals chamber rejected Israel's challenge to ICC jurisdiction 1 week ago, on December 15, which hardened Washington's stance. Legal blogs like Verfassungs's blog and the American Society of International Law summarized the panel's view that crimes on Palestinian territory fall under the court's authority, regardless of the suspect's nationality. The two judges sanctioned were part of the majority that endorsed that position.
So this is tied directly to the Gaza investigation?
Yes, and that probe accelerated after the Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023, and Israel's subsequent campaign in Gaza. The Washington Post and AP News have noted that prosecutor Karim Khan sought arrest warrants in 2024 for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. By November of that year, judges issued warrants citing alleged starvation tactics and disproportionate strikes that, according to Gaza's health ministry figures quoted by the New Arab, helped push the Palestinian death toll over 40,000.
What legal tool is the U.S. using to punish ICC officials?
These sanctions flow from Executive Order Number 14203, signed in February of this year by President Donald Trump, and grounded in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The order allows penalties against foreign persons directly engaged in ICC cases against Americans and designated allies, which U.S. officials say includes Israel. According to Courthouse News Service and the Treasury's own guidance, it mirrors the earlier sanctions the administration slapped on Prosecutor Khan and his deputies earlier this year.
What do the penalties look like for these judges?
They are broad and personal. The New Arab and Truthout reported that any assets in U.S. reach are frozen, the judges face a U.S. travel ban, and banks worldwide often overcomply to avoid secondary risks. Human rights groups told HRW that even digital life takes a hit, with credit cards blocked and cloud accounts suspended as Microsoft or Amazon providers err on the side of U.S. rules.
That sounds sweeping. Are the judges saying anything?
Some ICC officials have described the impact as economically and socially wiping, language quoted by Middle East Monitor. The court's president, Tomoko Akane, said, quote, "We will proceed undeterred and defend judicial independence," end quote, in statements carried by Amnesty International and ICC channels. According to FIDH, the court is exploring shifts to non-U.S. tech to reduce vulnerability.
How is Israel responding to all this?
Israeli officials have lauded Washington's stance. The Times of Israel reported Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar calling the sanctions a moral, clear position against what he labeled anti-Semitic bias at the court. And Netanyahu has long argued, as Anadolu Agency noted, that Israel's own judiciary investigates misconduct, reinforcing the case that the ICC should not intervene.
Walk us through the U.S. legal arguments again. What's the foundation?
There are three pillars. First, Washington says you cannot bind non-parties to the Rome Statute without consent, citing the Vienna Convention. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and FDD, as quoted by Think and AIPAC, argue the ICC's territorial claim overreaches sovereignty. Second, under the Rome Statute's complementarity rule, the ICC steps in only if national courts are unwilling or unable, and the U.S. and Israel say Israel's system is functioning. NPR has noted Israel has prosecuted soldiers in past conflicts. Third, they challenge Palestine's statehood basis for ICC jurisdiction, arguing it does not meet the Montevideo criteria, even though the ICC and over 120 Rome Statute parties treat Palestine as a member.
These sanctions, how many ICC people are targeted now?
The two new judges raised the total to 11 ICC officials under U.S. sanctions this year. That includes 8 judges and 3 prosecutors, according to aa.com.tr, and the State Department's designations. The earlier House push, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, passed the House in January but stalled in the Senate. Yet the executive order gave the administration all the authority it wanted.
How unusual is it to punish judges this way?
It is rare and controversial. Human Rights Watch and the International Commission of Jurists say it is an attack on judicial independence that could chill international adjudication well beyond the Gaza files. And AP News points out that this reprises a tactic from 2020 when the U.S. briefly sanctioned ICC staff over Afghanistan, though these measures are broader and paired with an emergency declaration labeling the court an unusual and extraordinary threat.
What are allies saying, especially in Europe?
The European Union's foreign chief, Kaja Kallas, expressed deep regret on December 19, warning about the erosion of accountability, a line reported by Al Jazeera. France, Belgium, Finland, Denmark, Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia have urged Washington to reverse course. aa.com.tr noted France highlighted the knock-on effects for over 125 Rome Statute parties. Lawyers in Brussels told Mondak that the EU is weighing its blocking statute and a new anti-coercion instrument, but as of today, the Commission is only monitoring implications, leaving companies to navigate legal crosswinds.
Any reaction from the United Nations?
Yes. The UN Human Rights Office today called the move an intensification of reprisals undermining global justice, according to coverage from Gemini and local U.S. outlets. The message is that sanctioning judges for their rulings sets a dangerous precedent for all international courts, not just the ICC.
How about in Georgia and Mongolia, where these judges are from?
In Georgia, Civil.ge reports opposition parties are blasting the government for failing to shield Lord Kipanidze, who once served as justice minister, and it is feeding an already tense election year atmosphere. Mongolia, an ICC member state, is caught between its treaty obligations and U.S. leverage. Outlets like OC Media noted it already drew criticism in 2024 for not arresting Vladimir Putin during a visit, so this raises the stakes for its diplomacy.
Are we seeing concrete impacts on the judges' daily lives?
Absolutely. European banks are freezing personal and family accounts, and SWIFT rails are effectively cut off to avoid violating U.S. sanctions, according to law firm memos from Wilmer Hale and Gade. People close to the judges told Middle East Monitor that even simple online transactions or subscription renewals fail, while airlines quietly refuse bookings to avoid issues at U.S. border preclearance points.
Is this pressure working? Or is it backfiring?
It seems to be hardening positions on both sides. HRW and Amnesty say the court is more defiant, not less. And NPR notes that the rulings continue to move forward despite the personal cost to officials. At the same time, the administration is signaling that any state cooperating with these warrants could face secondary consequences, which may deter some governments.
How does this intersect with the war on the ground?
The New Arabs Live blog today links the sanctions discourse to an ongoing humanitarian emergency with intermittent aid halts and warnings of famine well into 2026. Al Jazeera has reported on continuing Israeli strikes in Gaza alongside ceasefire talks sputtering in Doha and even Miami back channels, none of which have produced a durable truce. The ICC's case file cites alleged starvation tactics and attacks on protected sites, which makes the legal and humanitarian tracks inseparable.
You mentioned Israeli defense exports earlier. Why does that matter here?
It shows the paradox. Despite ICC scrutiny, Israeli arms exports hit roughly $14.8 billion in 2024, according to Globe, citing the defense ministry, with Europe taking about 54% after deals like Romania's $2.2 billion Spider air defense purchase. Journalist Anthony Lowenstein told Al Jazeera that marketing systems as battle-tested in Gaza raises complicity questions for buyers, especially if the ICC ultimately substantiates war crimes.
Are there protests here tied to the sanctions?
Yes, and they have broadened beyond court politics. The New Arab reported a rally at Oakland's port on December 19, calling for a U.S. arms embargo, tying the sanctions to a perceived attempt to shield wartime conduct. Activists say punishing judges while restricting aid sends the wrong signal about accountability and humanitarian priorities.
Legally, could the ICC enforce these arrest warrants without U.S. or Israeli cooperation?
Only through member states. The ICC relies on the 120-plus parties to the Rome Statute to execute warrants, so travel becomes risky for targeted officials if allied capitals decide to cooperate. The appeals decision on December 15 strengthened the court's view of its territorial jurisdiction, but in practice it still hinges on political will in capitals from Brussels to Buenos Aires.
Is there any talk of reciprocal measures against the U.S.?
Europe is cautious, but exploring defensive tools. Policy groups tracking the EU's anti-coercion instrument told the European Parliament outlet EUPAC that the bloc could shield firms from overcompliance, yet key capitals fear a transatlantic trade fight. Meanwhile, some Rome Statute parties are discussing pooled legal support funds for sanctioned ICC personnel, though that remains discreet.
How is Congress reacting?
On the Hill, the earlier Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act showed House appetite for going even further, but the Senate tap-braked to avoid alienating allies. According to AP News, the White House argues its executive order and the American Service Members Protection Act already provide sufficient leverage to protect U.S. service members and partners. Republicans and some Democrats frame the ICC as overstepping, while a progressive bloc warns this undermines the rules-based order Washington claims to champion.
What's the ICC's next step in the Israel-Palestine file?
Prosecutor Karim Khan is expected to keep pursuing evidence on alleged starvation as a method of warfare, targeting of civilians, and attacks on protected sites like hospitals and schools. The Washington Post has noted that complementarity challenges from Israel will continue, with Israeli investigations cited as reasons to pare back ICC claims, but the appeals ruling narrows that off-ramp. In short, the file is not closing, and the court is acting as if it has time and member state backing.
Does the U.S. see any off-ramp here?
State Department officials hint that if the ICC narrows its focus away from high-level Israeli decision-makers, sanctions could be reviewed, but that is speculative and politically fraught. The administration's red line is prosecutions of U.S. and allied nationals without consent, a stance reinforced in state.gov briefings. For now, the logic is escalation to deter cooperation with the warrants.
Could this spill into NATO or G7 friction next year?
That is the risk. Allies are gaming out 2026 scenarios, where EU blocking rules clash with U.S. sanctions, putting banks and tech platforms in a legal bind, as reported by NHC and European legal analysts. The Japan Times framed it as a stress test for multilateralism. Can Western democracies defend courts they say uphold global norms while protecting an ally under unprecedented scrutiny?
Bottom line, what does this moment tell us?
It lays bare the divide between power and principle. According to Middle East Monitor and Al Mayadeen, critics see U.S. hypocrisy in punishing a court while preaching accountability elsewhere. Supporters counter that sovereignty and due process must come first. Either way, sanctioning judges for their rulings moves this fight from the battlefield into the legal architecture built after World War II.
Ethan, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you, Grace.
California's in a bitter fight with Washington over immigration enforcement, and it centers on masks and badges. Chloe, walk us through what the state actually passed.
California approved 2 laws back in late September that are set to kick in on January 1st, unless courts say otherwise. The first, the No Secret Police Act, bans on-duty officers, including federal agents, from wearing identity-concealing masks, with narrow carve-outs for undercover work, SWAT, or medical gear. The second, the No Vigilantes Act, requires non-uniformed officers to show who they are and who they work for. The Los Angeles Times and The Guardian reported that Governor Gavin Newsom framed them as basic accountability, saying they keep, quote, no one above the law, end quote.
What's the situation right now, just days before those rules are supposed to start?
As of today, December 22, 2025, they're effectively paused for federal agents. A federal judge approved a temporary agreement on December 9th. California won't enforce the mask or ID requirements against federal entities while the lawsuit plays out. Bloomberg Law noted that means agents will face no state penalties on January 1st, even if they wear face coverings. The court will take up the Justice Department's request for a preliminary injunction early next year.
So why did California go this route in the first place?
State leaders say it's a response to the Trump administration's mass deportation push, which ramped up raids in workplaces and public spaces this year. According to the Los Angeles Times, operations have featured masked, heavily armed teams using unmarked vehicles at farms, car washes, and even big-box store parking lots. Viral videos showed scenes that Governor Newsom compared to a, quote, dystopian sci-fi movie, end quote, with people vanishing into vans. Those images lit a fire under immigrant communities and lawmakers.
There were a couple of tragedies that really intensified the backlash. What do we know?
2 deaths in 2025 became rallying points. In March, a Guatemalan man named Carlos Roberto Montoya was struck and killed on a freeway while fleeing a raid at a Home Depot in Monrovia, according to coverage compiled by the LA Times. Then, in July, farm worker Jaime Alanis Garcia fell from a greenhouse roof in Ventura County and died while hiding from agents. Those cases, seen widely online, fed protests and sharpened the argument that anonymity fuels fear and chaos.
How did the federal government respond to these state measures?
The Justice Department sued California on November 17th, arguing the laws violate the Supremacy Clause and unlawfully regulate federal operations. Attorney General Pamela Bondi contends California can't dictate federal uniforms or safety gear and cites a spike in assaults on ICE officers as a safety rationale. DHS officials say anonymity protects agents from doxing and threats, and they've instructed personnel to keep using tactical masks. The Washington Post has noted that this mirrors past federal-state showdowns, where Washington asserts broad supremacy in immigration enforcement.
That assault claim gets a lot of attention. Is there data behind it?
DHS says assaults jumped from 19 in 2024 to 238 this year through November, which they frame as a more than 1,000% increase. Officials attribute that partly to rhetoric from sanctuary state politicians, but researchers push back on the causation claim. UC Irvine criminologists told local outlets that the surge in street arrests versus jail pickups is a better explanation, and the Cato Institute made the same point about small baseline numbers inflating percentages. A Los Angeles Times review found many incidents were minor, like spitting or thrown water bottles, and several cases were dropped when body cam footage undercut intent or injury.
You mentioned the lawsuit hinges on federal supremacy. What kinds of precedents matter here?
The Supreme Court has long limited state interference with federal functions, and legal scholars say that context favors Washington. In Eagle from 1890 shielded a U.S. Marshal from state prosecution for actions tied to federal duties, and Johnson v. Maryland in 1920 said a state couldn't force a postal worker to get a state license to do his job. More recently, in 2018, the Ninth Circuit let California limit its own cooperation with ICE, but struck parts of a law that directly obstructed federal operations. Lawfare and Justice Department briefs argue California's mask and ID mandates look like direct regulation of how federal agents do their work, which courts have usually rejected.
California has a portal now for reporting federal misconduct. What's the purpose there?
The state launched an online reporting tool on December 2nd to collect complaints about ICE, Border Patrol, and federalized guard units. The Attorney General's office says it's a way to gather evidence for civil actions and pattern and practice claims, not to bring state charges against federal personnel. According to CBS News, people can file in multiple languages and upload photos or video links, though the site warns reports might not lead to immediate action. Critics call it symbolic, especially with the non-enforcement agreement, but state officials say documentation matters for accountability.
How are federal raids unfolding on the ground right now?
The campaign, branded Operation Midway Blitz, intensified across Southern California this month, targeting areas like Riverside, Anaheim, and San Diego. Eyewitnesses told The Guardian and the LA Times that agents still arrive in tactical gear, sometimes masked, and use tools like backpack drones and so-called self-deportation letters that push fast voluntary departures. Advocates argue those letters pressure people into waiving rights, while federal officials say they streamline cases and reduce detention. The joint operations have continued despite legal wrangling and local protests.
What about the economic and social ripple effects?
Employers in agriculture and hospitality are reporting labor participation drops of roughly 3 to 6%. As undocumented workers avoid fields, hotels, and public transit out of fear. School attendance in some districts has slipped, with families keeping kids home on rumored raid days, according to the Los Angeles Times. Community clinics say stress-related visits are up, and shelters report more people sleeping in shifts away from home. The climate of uncertainty extends beyond those targeted, affecting mixed-status households and lawful residents who fear mistaken identity.
There was also a military angle that courts weighed in on. Where does that stand?
The administration deployed National Guard troops and hundreds of Marines to Los Angeles amid unrest tied to immigration operations, but a federal judge curbed that use earlier this month. Cal Matters and ABC 10 reported that on December 10th, the court blocked the domestic immigration deployment as insufficiently justified. The ruling underscored long-standing limits on using the military for civilian law enforcement. It also reinforced how contentious and sprawling this enforcement build-out has become.
Politically, both sides seem dug in. What's the rhetoric like?
It's been blistering. A White House spokesperson mocked the governor with a slur and praised ICE as, quote, heroic, end quote, while California leaders leaned on phrases like, quote, secret police, end quote, and, quote, masked raids, end quote, echoing coverage in The Guardian and the Los Angeles Times. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem has backed agents who ignore the state laws, and federal prosecutors have even pointed people to FBI tip lines to report state officials. The escalated language reflects how immigration, state power, and public safety are colliding in real time.
The laws themselves have some carve-outs. Can you explain those?
The mask ban isn't absolute, and that's important context. It allows face coverings for undercover assignments, tactical SWAT situations, or medical needs like N95 masks, as well as protective gear for firefighters and hazmat teams. What it targets is the routine use of balaclavas or ski masks during everyday enforcement, especially when identities are otherwise hidden. The companion law simply requires plainclothes officers to show either a name or a badge number and the agency they work for.
If the courts do side with the administration, what does that mean for other states?
A ruling against California would likely discourage similar measures in sanctuary states that were watching this closely. The 2022 Supreme Court decision in United States v. Washington already warned states not to single out federal workers for adverse treatment, and this case tests that boundary in the uniform and ID context. If the injunction is granted early next year, it will set a strong signal that direct regulation of federal tactics is off limits. States would likely shift to indirect strategies, like limiting local cooperation and funding oversight, where courts have been more receptive.
And if California somehow prevails?
That would be a surprise, given the precedent stack, but it would open a new lane for state regulation around transparency in federal policing. Other states could adopt mask and ID rules tethered to public safety, with narrow exceptions, and argue they're neutral and generally applicable. The Ninth Circuit's past rulings would still matter, so any victory would probably be narrow and heavily conditioned. Even then, federal officers could try to remove state prosecutions to federal court under existing immunity statutes.
Where does public opinion seem to be on this?
It's split, and it depends on whose safety people prioritize. According to NPR's reporting on sanctuary debates, Californians often back limits on cooperation with ICE, but images of street confrontations and the assault narrative can shift views toward officer protection. Immigrant advocates emphasize due process and the chilling effect on communities, using those viral videos as evidence. Business groups, especially in agriculture, are warning about labor shocks and lost harvests if fear keeps workers away.
We've talked about the headline numbers, but there's a human toll too. What are advocates seeing?
December has been especially grim. Local outlets like LA Taco and Human Rights Monitors reported that this month is on pace to be the deadliest for immigrants in custody this year, with dozens of deaths tied to medical neglect and suicide. Legal aid groups say clients are increasingly refusing to open doors or even seek hospital care, fearing encounters with masked agents. That's the context in which California says unmasking is not just symbolic but about rebuilding trust.
How's Governor Newsom framing the next steps?
He's positioning the mask and ID rules as part of a broader resistance package, which also includes keeping schools and child care centers off limits for immigration enforcement. According to Cal Matters, he's betting that documentation from the misconduct portal and a steady drumbeat of public stories will sway courts, or at least the court of public opinion. He called recent raids, quote, reckless, end quote, and singled out a December 19th operation in Mecca where agents wore what he described as, quote, horror masks, end quote, a claim reported by The Guardian. Expect him to keep pressing the narrative that transparency equals safety.
And from the administration side, what's the plan?
Keep the pressure on and keep the masks on. DOJ is moving for an injunction in early 2026, and DHS leadership is telling agents to ignore the state rules under the temporary non-enforcement deal. Fox News has amplified claims about officer assaults and threats, which the administration uses to justify anonymity. If the court grants the injunction, Washington will claim vindication and continue large-scale operations.
Any final obstacles or wrinkles we should watch?
Watch the intergovernmental immunity arguments, which say states can't discriminate against federal entities or unduly burden them, and see how the judge weighs public safety claims from both sides. Also keep an eye on whether California tries to enforce these laws against state and local officers even if federal agents remain exempt under court order, a split approach that could create confusion on the street. And remember, even paused laws-shaped behavior agencies are already drafting public masking policies because the statutes require transparency. The pieces are moving, even under a temporary truce.
Bottom line for listeners, as we head into the holiday week,
the laws still exist on paper, but they won't touch federal agents on January 1st because the state agreed not to enforce them while the case proceeds. Raids will continue, the rhetoric will stay hot, and the courts will have the final say, likely early next year. In the meantime, California is documenting everything through that portal and betting that daylight can change how these operations look and feel. Whether that's legally enforceable or just politically potent is what the judges will decide.
Clear and comprehensive as always. Chloe, thanks for making sense of it. Here are some other headlines. In Moscow, a blast on Yasenovaya Street turned rush hour into hush hour. Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov, chief of the Russian General Staff's Operational Training Directorate, was mortally wounded when an explosive device detonated beneath his car early Monday. Investigators have opened a murder probe and pointed a finger squarely at Ukrainian intelligence, calling it a targeted assassination. His death is the third such killing of a top general in the capital within a year, after Igor Kirillov in December 2024 and Yaroslav Moskalik in April 2025. Analysts say the spree spotlights security shortfalls and could chill Florida peace talks. Japan is rebooting more than computers. The Niigata Prefectural Assembly voted confidence in Governor Hideo Hanazumi, clearing the political path to restart TEPCO's Kashiwazaki Kariwa plant, the world's largest nuclear facility, and the first TEPCO reactor to return since Fukushima. TEPCO aims to reawaken the 1.35 gigawatt No. 6 reactor as soon as January 20th, pending final checks. Tokyo pitches the move as watts and cents, bolstering energy security, cutting costly fossil imports, and feeding power-hungry AI data centers, while marching toward 2050 net zero. Outside, roughly 300 protesters said, "No glow," citing safety and trust deficits. Eyes up. Allied intelligence warns Russia is crafting a zone-effect anti-satellite system to sandblast low Earth orbit. The concept deploys swarms of millimeter pellets, a stealthy shrapnel cloud that could cripple Starlink and more, with particles too tiny to easily track, complicating blame. Canada's Space Division calls the tech plausible. CSIS analysts caution it could clip even the International Space Station and cascade into Kessler chaos, debris begetting debris. With timelines sealed, NATO now weighs what constitutes an attack on commercial constellations. One small shot for man could be one giant mess for mankind. Across the Pacific, India and New Zealand sealed a rapid-fire free trade accord after 9 months, fast by Delhi standards, faster by Wellington winds. The pact grants India duty-free access on all its exports and lowers or erases tariffs on 95% of New Zealand goods, from sheep meat to horticulture. Sensitive Indian sectors like dairy and sugar stay fenced, but Wellington commits up to $20 billion in investment over 15 years and expands pathways for professionals and students. Its curry meets kiwi for 1.4 billion plates, though NZ first grumbles over dairy and visas. Formal signing is slated for early 2026. And in North Carolina, power is being redrafted like a playbook. An investigative report outlines a decade-long Republican push in the General Assembly to hem in Democratic governors, culminating in Senate Bill 382, moving the State Board of Elections under the state auditor, now Republican Dave Bolek. Lawmakers also curbed the governor's hand in judicial appointments and oversight of agencies, including the Highway Patrol and Utilities Commission, while a 2025 REINS Act reins in rulemaking. Governor Josh Stein and former Governor Roy Cooper are suing, but a 5-2 GOP state Supreme Court sets a steep uphill. The outcome could shape how votes are cast, counted, and challenged in a perennial presidential battleground. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.